Shalom Aleichem, a good night of Shabbos, Pasha Zocher, Timche, Es Amolik, erase Amolik. Amolik is doubts, Amolik is kaltkeit, apathy. We have that opportunity this Shabbos. Yesterday, Vav Adar was the 32nd Yahrtzeit of Reb Shmaryo Gorari, known as the Rashag, the Rebbe's brother-in-law, the previous Rebbe's older son-in-law, who came from the illustrious family, Chabad family, Midayre Dayres, going back to the Alter Rebbe, the Gorari family. So I'd like to take a few minutes to mention a few things about him. He was born in 1898 in Kremenchuk, Ukraine, with the Gorari family. His father and two brothers owned various businesses, a tobacco company and other types of businesses. And they were among the leaders of the Jewish community in the sense of connections, leadership, support. I wrote about this in my book, where Chabad and Gedolim number 2, a little history of the Goraris in Kremenchuk, which is interesting because there was a lot of Frumkeit and Yiddishkeit in Kremenchuk from the 1870s, 80s until 1920 or so, and the Goraris were a mainstay. And in fact, for example, Reb Shaya Denberg, who was the father of Reb Label Denberg Zolzai and the Chabad Lubavitcher family of Denberg, in the early years, in 1951, 52, those years, Reb Label Denberg, who lives in Montreal, was in Crown Heights in 770, and he met the Rashag, and he asked him, "Who are you?" And the Rashag asked Reb Label, he says, "I'm Label Denberg." He says, "Oh, your father, who's your Rashai?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Your father taught me smicha in 1915 in Lubavitch, I believe." And because of that, I'm sorry, not in Lubavitch. He taught him smicha in Kremenchuk when Reb Shaya wanted to get out of the draft, the preziv. So the Goraris would hire you, and when he hired you, then you were able to get away from being drafted. So the Goraris made a deal. Rashag's father made a deal with Reb Shaya Denberg, who was a Goy Neulam, a Talmud Chacham. He said, "If you teach my son for smicha, I'll hire you officially and you'll avoid the draft." And kachava, that's the way it was. Anyway, they say that he learned by heart 300 Maimorim. And this was one of the reasons that the Frierdiker Rebbe chose him as a son-in-law. The Rashag was a very powerful person, in a way very much underestimated, and naturally because the Rebbe became our Rebbe and the focus is on the Rebbe and everything that the Rebbe does, he took a back seat, which ultimately, actually a few years after the Rebbe's Nesias in 1953 or so, he got on board and he saw that the Rebbe is the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, and he was ichmavatul. He connected himself and gave himself over completely to the Rebbe. I heard from my mashpia, Reb Melech Tzibul Olav Shalom, who told me that the Rashag was more bottled to the Rebbe than to the Frierdiker Rebbe. He didn't explain, and I don't believe an explanation is necessary. Those that know. Those that don't know should find out or not find out. But his bittul to the Rebbe was tremendous. In 1940, he came along with the Frierdiker Rebbe to America, and he was appointed by the Frierdiker Rebbe to be in charge of Tomchei Mimim. He was the Menayel Poyel of Tomchei Mimim, the principal, the dean, the administrator of the Yeshiva, of the Lubavitch Yeshiva, and he opened 14 yeshivas he had under him. This was reported in a publication called the Americana, a Yiddish kind of journal in the 40s, and they have a write-up. I put it also into the book of the Rashags' personality and his accomplishments on behalf of Lubavitch and the Frierdiker Rebbe. He had 14 yeshivas. And all the decisions, the Frierdiker Rebbe and then the later regarding yeshivas, they wanted him to go through the Rashag, and they did. I'll give you an example. Reb Mordechai Oltein, who was appointed by the Frierdiker Rebbe to open the yeshiva in Pittsburgh and then in the Bronx, the Achei Tmimim. So in the 70s, his family was, they were getting married, the children, and he had a salary that went back to 1945 or so. So he asked permission from the Rashag to increase his salary by a little bit. He went into the Rashag. This was told over by Rabbi Rosenfeld, who happened to be there and overhear the conversation. And the Rashag, he asked, for such a small increase, the Rashag burst out laughing. Of course you can have an increase. But the point is, he had the Kabbalah soil. This is the virtue of Reb Mordechai Oltein, Olav Shalom, the great chassid who passed on this past year at the age of 100. To have this Kabbalah soil, that, the Frierdiker Rebbe told him in the 40s that to discuss everything with the Rashag about the yeshivas, just continued on the next 30, 40 years. So the Rashag was a powerful man, but I want to talk about his connection with Litvishe Rosh Yeshivas, namely Rabbi Aaron Kotler, Rabbi Yitzchak Ruderman, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and others. I heard this from Ramosha Bogimilski, Zol Zayin Gesundheit, Refuah Shalem, Meteka Miyad. It was a very sticky situation. You understand, in the 40s, like I wrote about in Lakewood and Lubavitch, there was, many issues between the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Aaron Kotler, and it's a whole discussion for itself. And then the 50s, there was reparation money being given. The yeshiva started to work with each other, the Mir Yeshiva with Rabbi Avram Kalman Novitz and the Lakewood Yeshiva with the Cutlers, Rabbi and then Reb Schneier after he passed away in the 60s. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein wasn't a Rosh, Tiferet Yisraelayim, of course, Rabbi Moshe, and others. And how did Rashag balance it? On one hand, he's the son-in-law of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and we know the issues between the Frierdiker Rebbe, between the Rabban and the Frierdiker Rebbe, and it was serious. And at the same time, he maintained contact with these Rosh Yeshivas. And I believe that this was hero, besides his, brightness and his cleverness, that in order for the betterment of all yeshivas, including Tomchei Mimim, you have to keep the lines open, the channels open, and in a smart way, dialogue. And Rabbi Bogimilski told me that once Rabbi Aaron Kotler said, "So what does the Rebbe say about it?" This was after the Istalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe in the 50s. So he was kind of an in-between Lubavitch and the Litvishe world, and because of his stature as a spokesman, as a sophisticate, the way he was dressed and the way he carried himself with elegance and forthrightness and diplomacy, he had weight. He really, really was a very powerful person. And the Litvishe world in those years respected him. And they needed him, and they wanted him. Now you have to understand that even people who came from Russia, the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rashag had connections with many, many Russian Yidden. Probably anyone that was anything in Russia, they knew. Even the Litvaks there, the wealthy Litvaks, and they were supporting Reb Chaim Moiser and Tomchei Mimim. And the Rashag comes to America, the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't well, and he was the one that had these connections. So I heard that in the 40s, they reached out to the Rashag to try to get them into the various people for their Litvishe yeshivas. So this is another element of what he did, especially in the 40s and the 50s, in the 60s, bridging the gap between Lubavitch. But as the years went on, he became more and more makusher, more and more connected to the Rebbe. I'll tell you one story. In 1966 or 67, 68, those years, they were building a new yeshiva on Ocean Parkway. There was a Jew who funded it, Mr. Grus, Joseph Grus. His CFO was Joe Froelich. I met Joe Froelich in Yisrael and I interviewed him. And Joe Froelich told me that the yeshiva wanted to have Mr. Grus give them the money and they were going to build a building. And Mr. Grus said, no, I build the building and you get a free building, but that's the way we do it. He did it for Square, he did it for other yeshivas, and that's the way he did it. Well, the Rashag and Rabbi Weinberg and Rabbi Katz and those people that worked with him didn't like this arrangement for whatever reason. So the Rashag asked Mr. Grus if he's willing to go to the Rebbe for the Rebbe to mediate. And they said, sure. And they went into the Rebbe for Yechidus, and the Rashag presented his position, the yeshiva's position, and Mr. Grus and Joe Froelich presented their position. And the Rebbe, after listening to both, said to Mr. Grus and Joe Froelich, Geit eier Weg, just continue doing it your way. Fronted the Rashag, and the Rashag accepted it and had no tinus, and that's the way it was. So too with Yerushas, inheritance monies that was left over for the yeshiva over the years, the Rashag always gave either 50 or 51% to the Rebbe. And I believe it was in 1971, Tafshin Lamed Aleph, or 71, where the Rashag wrote after the Tishrei. He was so impressed with the Rebbe's Tishrei and the Giluyim and all the connection with the Russian Jews, and that he wrote a letter to the Rebbe saying, I want to be connected. I want to be connected. What's going to be with me? I want to be connected. And finally, towards the end of his life, after he had a stroke in the early 80s, the whole issue with the library, the Svarim, and his son, which was a very, very painful thing for him, he sided with the Rebbe. And the Rebbetzin, Chaim Mushke, said, my husband had one true chassid, and or maybe his greatest chassid was his brother-in-law, Reb Shmaryo Garari. So Ilul Nishmosei, so Hamalichting Gan Eden, we shouldn't forget him in the annals of Lubavitch, of Chabad. He did so much for us, and we should continue through strengthening the Yeshiva, the Lubavitch Yeshivas, the Kitzner Ran of Sheikh Elfar, V'hu B'teicham, and we'll have a Purim Sameach, V'napachu, V'zecher to the Gula Shleima, B'karav Mamish.